The Evolution of Real Estate Episode 1 Feudalism and Landlords. The feudal system existed, with particular features of one sort or another, in almost all countries. The era of feudalism covers a long period. In China, the feudal system existed for more than 2,000 years. In Western Europe, feudalism covers a number of centuries, from the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, 5th century, to the bourgeois revolution in England, 17th century, and in France, 18th century. In Russia from the 9th century to the Peasant Reform of 1861, in Transcaucasia from the 4th century to the 70s of the 19th century, among the peoples of Central Asia from the 7th or 8th centuries right up to the victory of the Proletarian Revolution in Russia. In Western Europe, feudalism arose out of the breakdown of Roman slave-owning society, on the one hand, and the decay of the tribal system of the conquering tribes, on the other. It was established as a result of the interaction of these two processes. Elements of feudalism, as already been said, had originated in the womb of slave-owning society in the form of the system of colony. The colony were obliged to work the land of their master, the large landowner, to make him a definite money payment or hand over a considerable share of the harvest, and to fulfill various types of duty. Nevertheless, the colony had more interest in their labor than the slaves, since they had their own holdings. Thus there arose new productive relations which achieved full development in the feudal period. Tribes of Germans, Gauls, Slavs and other peoples living in different parts of Europe destroyed the Roman Empire. The slave owner's power was overthrown and slavery fell. The large latifundia and handicraft workshops based on slave labor broke down. The population of the former Roman Empire consisted of large landowners, former slave owners, who had adopted the system of colony, freed slaves, colony, small peasants and artisans. The conquering tribes, at the time of the subjugation of Rome, had a communal system which was in decline. The village community, which the Germans called the Mark, played a great part in the social life of these tribes. The land, except for the large landed possessions of the clan nobility, was common property. The forests, heaths, pastures and ponds were used in common. Fields and meadows were redivided every few years among the members of the community. Gradually, however, the land around the homestead, and later also the plowland, began to be inherited by separate families. The distribution of land, the investigation of matters concerning the community, the settlement of disputes between its members, were dealt with by the community meeting and by the elders and judges elected by it. At the head of the conquering tribes stood their military leaders who, together with their retinues, held considerable tracts of land. The tribes which conquered the Roman Empire acquired a great part of its state lands and some part of the lands of the large proprietors. Forests, meadows and pastures remained in common use, but the plowland was divided into separate holdings. Later the divided lands became the private property of the peasants. Thus a broad stratum of independent small peasantry was formed. The peasants, however, were unable to preserve their independence for long. Property inequality between different members of the village community inevitably developed on the basis of private ownership of land and other means of production. Well-to-do and poor families appeared among the peasants. With the growth of property inequality, members of the community who had grown rich began to acquire power over the community. The land was more and more concentrated in the hands of the rich families, the clan aristocracy and military leaders. The peasants fell into personal dependence on the large landowners. The conquest of the Roman Empire hastened the breakup of the clan system among the conquering tribes. In order to maintain and strengthen their power over the dependent peasants, the large landowners had to reinforce the organs of state power. Military leaders, relying on the clan aristocracy and the members of their retinues, began to concentrate power in their hands and became kings, monarchical rulers. A number of new states headed by kings were formed on the ruins of the Roman Empire. The kings generously handed out the land they had seized for the lifetime and afterwards for the hereditary possession of their attendants, who had to bear military service in return. The church, which served as an important support for the royal power, received much land. The land was worked by peasants who now had to fulfill a number of duties for their new masters. Huge landholdings passed into the hands of members of the royal retinue and servants, the clerical authorities and the monasteries. The lands distributed on such conditions were called feuds, fiefs, hence comes the name of the new social structure, feudalism. The gradual conversion of peasant land into the property of feudal lords and the encirclement of the peasant masses, the process of feudalization, took place in Europe in the course of a number of centuries, from the 5th or 6th to the 9th or 10th centuries. The free peasantry was ruined by incessant military service, plunder and impositions. Turning for help to the large landowner, the peasants converted themselves into his dependents. Frequently the peasants were compelled to yield themselves into the protection of the feudal lord. Otherwise it was impossible for a defenseless man to exist in conditions of ceaseless wars and bandit raids. In such cases property rights in the plot of land passed to the feudal lord, and the peasant could work his plot only on condition of fulfilling various duties for the lord. In other cases the royal lieutenants and officials, by means of deceit and force, appropriated the land of free peasants, making the latter acknowledge their power. In different countries the process of feudalization took different courses, but the essence of the matter was everywhere the same. The formerly free peasants fell into personal dependence on the feudal lords who had seized their land. Sometimes this dependence was weaker, sometimes stronger. In course of time the differences in the position of former slaves, colony and free peasants disappeared, and they were all converted into a single mass of peasant serfs. Gradually there was established the position which is described by the medieval phrase, "No land without its lord," i.e., without its feudal master. The kings were the supreme landowners. Feudalism was an essential stage in the historical development of society. Slavery had outlived itself. In these circumstances the further development of productive forces was only possible on the basis of the labor of the mass of dependent peasantry, possessing their own holdings, their own implements of production and having some interest in labor. As the history of mankind testifies, however, it is not obligatory that every people should pass through all stages of social development. For many people's conditions arise under which they have the possibility of missing one stage of development or another and of passing immediately to a higher stage. In Russia patriarchal slavery arose when the primitive community was breaking down. The development of society here, however, went in the main not along the road of slave owning, but of feudalization. The Slavonic tribes, even when the clan system was predominant among them, beginning from the 3rd century AD, attacked the Roman slave-owning empire, struggled to free the towns of the northern Black Sea coast which were in its power and played a great part in the overthrow of the slave-owning system. The transition from the primitive community to feudalism took place in Russia at a time when the slave-owning system had long since fallen in the countries of Western Europe, and when feudal relations had been stabilized there. The village community among the Eastern Slavs was called verv or mir. The community had meadows, forests and ponds in common use, but the plowland began to pass into the possession of separate families. An elder was at the head of the community. The development of private landowning led to the gradual breakdown of the village communities. The elders and tribal princes seized the land. The peasants, SMERDS, were at first free members of the community, but later fell into dependence on the large landowners, boyars. The church became the largest feudal owner. Grants by the princes, endowments and legacies made it the possessor of broad lands and the richest estates of those times. In the period of the formation of the centralized Russian state, 15th to 16th centuries, the grand princes and czars began to place Russian pomeshchat, their attendants and serving people on the land, i.e., to give them land and peasants on condition of their owing military service. Hence the names pomestay, fee or estate, and pomeshchik, lord of the manor. At that time the peasants were not yet finally bound to the landowner and the land. They had the right to transfer from one lord to another. At the end of the 16th century the lords, with a view to increasing the production of grain for sale, intensified their exploitation of the peasants. In connection with this the state in 1581 deprived the peasants of the right of transfer from one landlord to another. The peasants were completely bound to the land belonging to the lords and were thus converted into serfs. In the period of feudalism agriculture played a predominant part and tillage was its most important branch. Gradually, in the course of a number of centuries, methods of grain growing improved and market gardening, fruit growing, vine growing and butter making developed. In the early period of feudalism the fallow system predominated, but in forested regions the slash and burn system of tillage predominated. A plot of land was sown several years consecutively with some crop until the soil was exhausted. Then they transferred to another plot. Later an advance to the three-field system took place. In this the arable was divided into 3 fields of which in turn, one was used for winter crops, the second for spring crops and the third remained fallow. The three-field system began to spread in Western Europe between the 9th and the 10th, and in Russia from the 11th and 12th centuries onwards. It remained dominant throughout many centuries, being preserved until the 19th century and, in many countries, even to the present time. Agricultural equipment in the early period of feudalism was poor. The primitive wooden plow, soka, with iron share, the sickle, scythe and spade served as implements of labor. Later, the iron plow and harrow began to be used. The grinding of grain was for a long time carried out by hand, until wind and water mills became widespread. The property of the feudal lords in land and their incomplete property rights over the peasant serf were the basis of the production relations of feudal society. The peasant serf was not a slave. He had his own holding. The feudal lord could no longer kill him, but he could sell him. By the side of the property of the feudal lords there also existed the individual property of peasants and craftsmen in their implements of production and in their private holdings, based on personal labor. Large-scale feudal landed property was the basis for the exploitation of peasants by the lords. The feudal lord son de men occupied part of the land. The feudal lord granted another part of the land on extortionate conditions for use by the peasants. The lord allotted land to the peasants to hold, hence the expression holding. The peasant holding was the means by which the lord secured his labor force. With hereditary possession of his holding, the peasant was obliged to work for the lord to till the lord's soil with the help of his own implements and stock, or else to give the lord his surplus product in kind or in money. Such a system of economy inevitably presupposed the peasant's personal dependence on the landlord, a system of extra economic compulsion. If the lord had not had direct power over the person of the peasant, he would not have been able to compel to work for him a man who possessed land and tilled on his own account. The peasant serf's working time was divided into necessary and surplus time. During the necessary time, the peasant created the product necessary for his own existence and the existence of his family. During the surplus time he created the surplus product which was appropriated by the lord. The surplus labor of the peasant who worked on the lord's domain, or the surplus product created by the peasant in his own holding and appropriated by the lord, constitute feudal land rent. Feudal rent frequently swallowed up not only the peasant's surplus labor, but also part of his necessary labor. The basis of this rent was feudal ownership of land, linked with the direct domination of the feudal lord over the peasants dependent on him. Under feudalism there existed three forms of land rent: labor rent, rent in kind and money rent. In all these forms of rent the exploitation of the peasants by the landlords stood out in unconcealed form. Labor rent, or weak work, barshchina, predominated in the early stages of feudalism's development. Under the system of week work the peasant worked for a specified part of the week, 3 or more days, with his own implements of production, plow, draft animals, etc. On his master's estate, and the remaining days worked on his own holding. Thus by week work the necessary and surplus labor of the peasant were clearly distinguished in time and space. The sphere covered by week work was exceedingly broad. The peasant plowed, sowed and gathered the harvest, pastured cattle, worked as a carpenter, chopped timber for the lord, and carted agricultural produce and building materials using his own horse. Under the week work system the peasant serf was interested in raising the productivity of labor only while working on his own holding. When working on the lord's land the peasant had no such interest. The feudal lord kept overseers who compelled the peasants to work. In the course of further development labor rent was replaced by rent in kind, or quotrent paid in produce. Under this system the peasant was obliged to deliver regularly to the lord a definite quantity of grain, cattle, poultry and other agricultural produce. Most frequently the quotrent was combined with remnants of week work duties, i.e., with the peasant's work on the lord's domain. With rent in kind the peasant expended the whole of his labor, both necessary and surplus, according to his own discretion. Necessary and surplus labor were no longer divided as clearly as with labor rent. Here the peasant became relatively more independent. This created a certain stimulus to further raising the productivity of labor. At a later stage of feudalism, when exchange had become comparatively widespread, money rent arose, or quotrent in money. Money rent is characteristic of the period of the breakdown of feudalism and the appearance of capitalist relations. Various forms of feudal rent often existed simultaneously. In all these forms of ground rent, whether labor rent, rent in kind, or money rent as a mere change of form of rent in kind, the rent-paying party is always supposed to be the actual tiller and possessor of the land, whose unpaid surplus labor passes directly into the hands of the landlord. Marx, Capital, Kerr edition, Volume 3, p. 932. Striving to increase their income, the feudal lords imposed every sort of exaction on the peasant. In many cases they had monopolistic possession of mills, smithies and other enterprises. The peasant was compelled to use them for exceedingly high payments in kind or money. Apart from quitrent in kind or money paid to the feudal lord, the peasant had to pay all sorts of imposts to the state, local taxes and, in some countries, a tithe, i.e., a tenth of the harvest to the church. Thus the labor of peasant serfs was the basis of the existence of feudal society. Peasants not only grew agricultural produce. They worked in the feudal lords' estates as craftsmen, erected castles and monasteries and made roads. Towns were built by the hands of peasant serfs. The economy of the feudal lords, particularly in the early stages of its development, was basically a natural economy. Each feudal estate, consisting of the lord's domain and the villages belonging to him, lived an isolated economic life, rarely engaging in exchange. The requirements of the feudal lord and his family, and the needs of the numerous household were at first satisfied by the produce from the seigneurial economy and supplied by the peasants paying quitrent. Fairly large estates had a sufficient quantity of craftsmen, mostly among the household serfs. These craftsmen made clothing and footwear, made and repaired weapons, hunting equipment and agricultural implements, and erected buildings. The peasant economy was also a natural one. The peasants engaged not only in agricultural labor but also in domestic handicraft, mainly working up raw materials produced in their holdings, spinning, weaving, making footwear and farm implements. For a long time a characteristic of feudalism was the combination of agriculture, as the basic branch of the economy, with domestic handicraft, which was auxiliary to it. The few imported products without which it was impossible to manage, as for example, salt and articles of iron, were at first supplied by wandering traders. Later, in connection with the growth of towns and handicraft, the division of labor and development of exchange between town and country made a great step forward. The exploitation of dependent peasants by feudal lords was the main feature of feudalism among all peoples. However, in particular countries the feudal system had its own special features. In countries of the East feudal relations were for a long time combined with slave relations. Thus it was in China, India, Japan and a number of other countries. Feudal state property in land was of great significance in the East. For example, in the period of the Baghdad Caliphate, under the dominance of the Arabs particularly in the 8th to 9th centuries AD, a large section of the members of peasant communities lived on the caliph's land and paid feudal rent direct to the state. Feudalism in the East was also characterized by the vitality of patriarchal clan relations which were utilized by the feudal lords as a means of intensifying exploitation of the peasants. In the agricultural lands of the East, where irrigated agriculture is of decisive significance, the peasants were in bondage to the feudal lords because not only the land but also the water resources and irrigation works were the property of the feudal state or of individual feudal lords. Among nomad peoples the land was used as pasture. The size of feudal land owning was determined by the quantity of cattle. The large cattle-owning feudalists were, in fact, large-scale owners of pasture. They held the peasantry in dependence and exploited them. The basic economic law of feudalism consisted in the production of surplus product to satisfy the demands of the feudal lords, by means of the exploitation of dependent peasants on the basis of the ownership of the land by the feudal lords and their incomplete ownership of the workers in production, the serfs. Towns had already arisen under the slave-owning system. Such towns as Rome, Florence, Venice and Genoa in Italy, Constantinople and Alexandria in the Near East, Paris, Lyons and Marseille in France, London in England, Samarkand in Central Asia, and many others, were inherited by the Middle Ages from the epoch of slavery. The slave-owning system fell, but towns remained. The large slave-owning workshops broke down, but the crafts continued to exist. In the period of the early Middle Ages the towns and crafts developed slowly. Town craftsmen produced articles for sale, but a large part of the objects of consumption which they needed they obtained from their own holdings. Many of them had small plocklands, gardens and cattle. The women engaged in the spinning of flax and wool to make clothing. This showed the limited extent of markets and exchange. In the countryside the working up of agricultural raw material was at first a subsidiary occupation of the husbandman. Then, from among the peasants there began to emerge craftsmen who served their own village. The craftsmen's productivity of labor increased. It became possible to produce more articles than were necessary for the feudal lord or the peasants of one village. The craftsmen began to settle around feudal castles, at the walls of monasteries, in large villages and other trading centers. Thus, gradually, usually on the waterways, new towns arose, in Russia, for example, Kiev, Pskov, Novgorod, Vladimir. In the course of time, crafts became a more and more profitable business. The skill of the craftsman was perfected. The feudal lord began to buy the product of handicraft from the townsmen. He was no longer satisfied with the work of his own serfs. The more developed crafts were finally isolated from agriculture. The towns which had arisen on the lands of lay and clerical feudal lords were subject to their authority. Townsmen owed a number of duties to the feudal lord, paid him quitrent in kind or money, and were subject to his administration and court. The town population very soon began the struggle for freedom from feudal dependence. Partly by force, partly by means of purchase, the towns obtained for themselves the right of self-administration, holding courts, minting coinage and collecting taxes. The town population consisted mainly of craftsmen and traders. In many towns, serfs fleeing from their landlords found refuge. The town acted as the center of commodity production, as distinct from the countryside where natural economy prevailed. The growth of competition from the fugitive serfs who had crowded into the towns, the struggle against exploitation and oppression by the feudal lords, caused the craftsmen to unite into guilds. The guild system existed in the feudal period in almost all countries. Guilds arose in Byzantium and Italy in the 9th and 10th centuries, and later in the whole of Western Europe and Russia. In the countries of the East, Egypt, China, and in the towns of the Arab Caliphate, guilds arose even earlier than in the European countries. The guilds united the town craftsmen of one specific trade or several similar ones. Only the master craftsmen were full members of the guilds. The master craftsmen had a small number of journeymen and apprentices. The guilds carefully preserved the exclusive right of their members to engage in that craft and regulated the process of production. They laid down the length of the working day. The number of journeymen and apprentices with each master defined the quality of raw materials and finished products and their prices, and frequently purchased raw material in common. Methods of work established by long tradition were obligatory for all. Strict regulation had as its aim the prevention of any single master from raising himself above the others. Apart from this, the guilds served as mutual aid organizations. The guilds were a feudal form of craft organization. In the first period of their existence, they played a certain positive part in assisting the strengthening and development of urban crafts. However, with the growth of commodity production and the expansion of the market, the guilds gradually became a brake on the development of productive forces. The strict regulation of craft production by the guilds fettered the craftsmen's initiative and hindered the development of technique. In order to limit competition, the guilds began to create all sorts of hindrances to those wishing to receive the rights of a master. For the apprentices and journeymen, whose numbers had considerably increased, the possibility of becoming independent masters had practically ceased. They were compelled to remain for their whole life in the position of hired wage workers. In these conditions, the relations between a master and his subordinates lost their former more or less patriarchal character. The masters intensified the exploitation of their subordinates, making them work 14 to 16 hours a day for insignificant pay. The journeymen began to unite into secret brotherhoods to defend their interests. The guilds and town authorities persecuted the journeymen's brotherhoods in every way. The richest section of the town population were the merchants. Trading activity developed both in the towns surviving from the period of slavery and in the towns which arose under feudalism. The organization of guilds in the crafts found their counterpart in the organization of guilds in trade. Merchant guilds in the feudal period existed almost everywhere. In the East they are known from the 9th century, in Western Europe from the 9th or 10th century, and in Russia from the 12th century. The basic task of the merchant guilds was the struggle with competition from outside merchants, the regulation of weights and measures, the defense of merchants' rights from the infringements of the feudal lords. In the 9th to 10th centuries there already existed considerable trade between the countries of the East and Western Europe. Kievan Rus, 1. took an active part in this trade. The Crusades, 11th to 13th centuries, played a great part in the expansion of trade, opening the Near Eastern markets for Western European merchants. A flood of gold and silver from the East swept into Europe. Money began to appear in places where it had formerly not been used. The Italian towns, particularly Genoa and Venice, which carried the Crusaders to the east in their trading vessels and supplied them with provisions, took a direct part in the conquest of eastern markets. For a long time the Mediterranean ports were the main centers of the trade linking Western Europe with the East. But apart from this, trade developed widely in the North German and Netherland towns scattered along the trade routes of the North and Baltic Seas. Here in the 14th century there arose a commercial union of towns, the German Hansa, which united in the following 2 centuries about 80 towns of various European countries. The Hanseatic League carried on trade with England, Scandinavia, Poland and Russia. In exchange for the growth of towns and development of trade greatly influenced the feudal countryside. The economy of the feudal lords began to be drawn into the market. In order to purchase luxury objects and articles of town crafts the feudal lords needed money. In connection with this it was convenient for the feudal lords to transfer the peasants from weak work and quitrent in kind to money quitrent. Feudal exploitation was still further intensified with the transfer to money quitrents. The contradiction between town and country which had arisen under slavery became still more acute. The feudal hierarchy feudal society was divided into 2 basic classes, feudal lords and peasants. Feudal society represented a division of classes under which the vast majority the peasant serfs were completely subjected to an insignificant minority the landlords, who owned the land. Lenin, The State, Selected Works, English edition, Volume 11, page 651. The class of feudal lords was not a uniform whole. Petty feudal lords paid tribute to those more powerful, helped them in war, but on the other hand took advantage of their patronage. The patron was called the baron or seigneur, and the one patronized the vassal, vavassar. The barons, seigneurs, in their turn, were vassals of still greater barons or lords, tenant-in-chief. Thus the feudal hierarchy was formed. As the ruling class, the feudal lords stood at the head of the state. They formed one estate, the baronage, nobility, lords. The lords held the honorable position of first estate and had wide political and economic privileges. The clergy, church and monastic, was also a very large landowner. It held extensive lands with a numerous dependent and serf population and was the ruling estate together with the nobles. The broad base of the feudal ladder was the peasantry. The peasants were subordinate to the landowner and were under the supreme power of the most powerful feudal lord, the king. The peasantry was an estate without political rights. The landlords were able to sell their serfs and made wide use of this right. The serf owners subjected the peasants to physical punishment. Lenin called serfdom serf slavery. The exploitation of peasant serfs was almost as cruel as the exploitation of slaves in the ancient world. Nevertheless, the serf could work part of the time on his own holding and could, to a certain degree, be independent. The contradiction between feudal lords and peasant serfs was the basic class contradiction of feudal society. The struggle of the exploited peasantry against the feudal lords was carried on throughout the whole period of feudalism and assumed particular intensity at the end of this period, when serf exploitation had been intensified to extremes. In the towns freed from feudal dependence, power was in the hands of the rich townsmen, merchants, usurers, owners of town lands and large house owners. The artisans of the various crafts who formed the main mass of the town population often stood out against the town nobility, winning their participation in the town administration together with the town aristocracy. The small craftsmen and journeymen struggled against the master craftsmen and merchants who were exploiting them. By the end of the feudal period, the town population was already considerably stratified. On the one hand, there were rich merchants and master craftsmen, on the other a broad mass of journeymen and apprentices, the town poor. The lower classes of the towns entered into the struggle against the united forces of the town nobility and feudal lords. This struggle fused into a single stream with the struggle of the peasant serfs against feudal exploitation. The kings, in Russia the grand princes and later the czars, were considered the holders of supreme power. Beyond the boundaries of their own holdings, however, the significance of the king's power in the period of early feudalism was insignificant. Frequently this power remained nominal. The whole of Europe was divided into a multitude of large and small states. The large feudatories were complete masters of their own possessions. They issued laws, saw to their execution, held courts of justice, inflicted penalties, maintained their own forces, raided their neighbors and did not always refrain from highway robbery. Many of them independently minted coinage. The smaller feudal lords also had exceedingly wide rights in respect of the people under their power. they tried to vie with the great lords. In the course of time, feudal relations created an exceedingly confused tangle of rights and obligations. Endless disputes and quarrels arose between the feudal lords. They were usually decided by force of arms in internecine wars. In the feudal period, a higher level of productive forces was achieved compared with the period of slavery. In the sphere of agriculture, the technique of production was improved. The iron plow and other iron implements of labor were used more extensively. New branches of cultivation arose. Vine growing, winemaking and market gardening developed considerably. Livestock husbandry grew, and particularly horse breeding, which was linked with the feudal lord's military service. Butter making developed. Sheep breeding became widespread in a number of regions. Meadows and pastures were extended and improved. Gradually, the implements of labor of the craftsmen and methods of processing raw material were improved. Former crafts began to become specialized. Thus, for example, the blacksmith had formerly produced all metal articles. In the course of time, the crafts of the armorer, nailmaker, cutler and locksmith separated from the trade of blacksmith, and the craft of the shoemaker and the saddlemaker were separated from the craft of the leather worker. In the 16th to 17th centuries in Europe, the spinning wheel became widespread. In 1600, the ribbon loom was invented. The improvement of the smelting and working of iron was of decisive significance in perfecting the implements of labor. At first, iron was produced by an exceedingly primitive method. In the 14th century, the water wheel was first used to work bellows for the blast, and heavy hammers to crush the ore. With the increased draft in the furnaces, instead of a malleable mass, a molten mass, cast iron, was obtained. With the application of gunpowder in warfare and the appearance of firearms, in the 14th century, much metal was required for cannonballs. From the beginning of the 15th century, they began to be cast from pig iron. More and more metal was needed for the production of agricultural and other implements. In the first half of the 15th century, the first blast furnaces appeared. The invention of the compass helped the further development of navigation and seafaring. The invention and spread of printing was of great significance. China had achieved a considerable development of its productive forces and culture by the 6th to 11th centuries, in many respects surpassing the Europe of that time. The Chinese were the first to invent the compass, gunpowder, writing paper and a very simple form of printing. The development of the productive forces of feudal society more and more clashed with the narrow framework of feudal production relations. The peasantry, under the yoke of feudal exploitation, were in no condition to increase further the output of agricultural produce. The productivity of unfree peasant labor was exceedingly low. In the town, the growth of the craftsman's productivity of labor came up against the obstacles created by guild statutes and rules. The feudal system was characterized by the slow rate of development of production, by routine and by the authority of tradition. The productive forces which had grown up in the framework of feudal society demanded new relations of production. The role of merchant capital in the feudal period commodity production gradually developed, town handicrafts expanded and peasant economy was more and more drawn into exchange. Production by small craftsmen and peasants, based on private property and personal labor creating products for exchange, is called simple commodity production. As has already been said, a product made for exchange is a commodity. Different commodity producers expend on the production of the same commodities an unequal quantity of labor. This depends on the different conditions in which they have to work. Commodity producers possessing improved implements expend on the production of one and the same commodity less labor in comparison with other commodity producers. In addition to differences in the implements of labor, differences in strength, dexterity, the skill of the worker and so on have their effect. The market, however, is not concerned in what conditions and with what implements one commodity or another is produced. For identical commodities on the market, one and the same amount of money is paid independent of those individual conditions of labor in which they were produced. Therefore, commodity producers whose individual labor expenditure, because of worse conditions of production, are higher than average cover only part of these costs when selling their commodities and ultimately are ruined. On the other hand, commodity producers whose individual labor expenditure thanks to better conditions of production are lower than average, are in an advantageous position when selling their commodities, and grow rich. This strengthens competition. A differentiation takes place among small commodity producers. The majority of them become more and more impoverished, an insignificant section grow rich. The divided condition of the country under feudalism was a great hindrance in the way of the development of commodity production. The feudal lords established at-will dues on imported goods, exacted tribute for passage through their possessions, and thus created serious obstacles to the development of trade. The requirements of trade and the economic development of society in general evoke the necessity of abolishing feudal separatism. The growth of handicraft and agricultural production, the development of the social division of labor between town and country, led to the intensification of economic links between different districts within the country and to the formation of a national market. The formation of a national market created the economic preconditions for the centralization of state power. The nascent town bourgeoisie was concerned to remove feudal obstacles and supported the creation of a centralized state. The kings, relying on the broader stratum of non-noble landowners, gentry, on the vassals of their vassals, and also on the rising towns, dealt the feudal nobility decisive blows and strengthened their own dominance. They became not only nominal, but also effective sovereigns in the state. Large national states emerged in the form of absolute monarchies. The overcoming of feudal separatism and the creation of centralized state power facilitated the appearance and development of capitalist relations. The formation of a world market was also of great significance for the rise of the capitalist order. In the second half of the 15th century, the Turks seized Constantinople and the whole of the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. The most important artery along which passed the trade routes between Western Europe and the East was cut. In the search for the sea route to India, Columbus discovered America in 1492, while in 1498 Vasco da Gama, having sailed round Africa, discovered the sea route to India. As a result of these discoveries, the focal point of European trade moved from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. The bulk of trade passed to the Netherlands, England and France. Russia played a noticeable role in European trade. With the rise of world trade and a world market, handicrafts were no longer in a position to satisfy the growing demand for goods. This hastened the transition from small-scale artisan production to large-scale capitalist production, based on the exploitation of wage workers. The advance from the feudal mode of production to the capitalist was made in two ways. On the one hand, the differentiation among the small commodity producers gave birth to capitalist entrepreneurs. On the other hand, merchant capital, through the merchants, directly subordinated production to itself. The guilds were able to limit competition and differentiation among the craftsmen so long as commodity production was little developed. With the development of exchange, competition became stronger and stronger. The masters working for a wider market in part obtained the alteration of guild restrictions, and in part simply evaded them. They lengthened the working day of the journeymen and apprentices, increased their number and applied more productive methods of labor. In conclusions, feudalism arose on the basis of the disintegration of slave-owning society and the breakup of the village community of the tribes which conquered the slave-owning states. In those countries where there had been no slave-owning system, feudalism arose on the basis of the breakup of the primitive community system. The clan aristocracy and military leaders of the tribes took into their hands a great quantity of lands and distributed them among their followers. The gradual enserfing of the peasants took place. The feudal lord's ownership of land and incomplete ownership of the worker in production, the peasant serf, was the basis of the relations of production in feudal society. As well as feudal property, there existed the individual property of the peasant and craftsman, which was based on personal labor. The labor of the peasant serfs was the source of the existence of feudal society. Serf exploitation was expressed in the fact that the peasants were compelled to perform weak work for the feudal lord, or to pay him quitrent in kind and in money. The burden that serfdom laid on the peasant was frequently little different from that of slavery. However, the serf system opened certain possibilities for the development of the productive forces, since the peasant could work a certain part of the time on his own holding and had a certain interest in his labor. The basic economic law of feudalism consists in the production of surplus product to satisfy the demands of the feudal lords, by means of the exploitation of dependent peasants, on the basis of the ownership of the land by the feudal lords and their incomplete ownership of the workers in production, the serfs. Feudal society, particularly in the period of the early Middle Ages, was split into small princedoms and states. The nobility and clergy were the ruling estates of feudal society. The peasant estate had no political rights. A class struggle between peasants and feudal lords took place throughout the whole history of feudal society. The feudal state, reflecting the interests of nobility and clergy, was an active force helping them to consolidate their right of feudal ownership of the land and to intensify their exploitation of the dispossessed and oppressed peasants. In the feudal epoch, agriculture played a predominant part, and the economy had a basically natural character. With the development of the social division of labor and exchange, the old towns which had survived the fall of the slave-owning system revived, and new towns arose. The towns were centers of handicraft and trade. The crafts were organized in guilds which strove to prevent competition. Traders united in merchant guilds. The development of commodity production, breaking down the natural economy, led to differentiation among the peasants and the craftsmen. Merchant capital hastened the decline of the crafts and promoted the birth of capitalist enterprise, the manufactories. Feudal limitations and territorial divisions acted as a brake on the growth of commodity production. In the process of further development, the national market was formed. The centralized feudal state arose in the form of absolute monarchy. Primitive accumulation of capital prepared the conditions for the rise of capitalism. Huge numbers of small producers, peasants, and craftsmen were deprived of the means of production. Great monetary wealth concentrated in the hands of large landowners, merchants, and usurers was created by means of the forcible expropriation of the peasantry, colonial trade, taxes, and the slave trade. Thus the formation of the basic classes of capitalist society, of wage workers and capitalists, was accelerated. More or less complete forms of the capitalist order of society grew and ripened in the womb of feudal society. The production relations of feudalism, the low productivity of the unfree labor of the peasant serfs, and guild restrictions, hindered the further development of productive forces. Peasant-serf risings shook the feudal system and led to the abolition of serfdom. The bourgeoisie took the lead in the struggle for the overthrow of feudalism. It made use of the revolutionary struggle of the peasants against the feudal lords in order to take power into its own hands. The bourgeois revolutions put an end to the feudal system and established the rule of capitalism, giving scope for the development of the forces of production.